All right, so this is the Living World Biodiversity, Unit 2, Module 13, Adaptations. So, our two learning goals today are describe how populations can evolve adaptations in response to environmental change, and then explain how evolution can occur over short and long time scales. Populations respond to environmental change through adaptations and evolution, a change in genetic composition in populations. So, the definition of evolution is a change in genetic composition in populations. When population level evolves, it's known as a microevolution. When a large category of organisms change, it is known as a macroevolution. So, micro would be like a microscope. That's how I remember it, and macro is the opposite. Um, so, a microevolution example would be like there's different varieties of apples or potatoes. You have your Gala apples, your Fuji apples, your um, sour apples, your green apples, your yellow apples. That would be a microevolution. And having a completely different fruit, maybe evolved out of the apple, would be an example of a macro evolution. So it wouldn't be even in the same genus. It might be in the same family, but not the same genus. So a gene is a physical location in a chromosome in the DNA that codes for a particular trait or body size. So if you remember from biology class, you have this looks like your chromosomes when they're getting ready to go through their changes. And we'll say right here is where a gene is located. And it could be different for everybody. So many traits have multiple variations known as alleles. So if eye color is a great example, you have blue, green, brown, black, hazel, gray. Hair color, you have a lot of different hair colors: blonde, brown, dirty blonde, red, those sorts of things. There are normal amount of changes in copying DNA known as mutations. So mutation is when the DNA is not exactly alike or there's a change in the gene. When a mutation is beneficial, it becomes called an adaptation. So not all mutations are beneficial. Some of them are harmful, some of them are helpful, and some of them have no effect at all. But when it is helpful, it's called an adaptation. When that adaptation can be passed on to the subsequent generations, this leads to evolution. So, there are a few different types of ways we describe evolution or how evolution takes place. So, natural selection is when adaptations go to lead changes. So, the end goal of any organism on Earth, with the exception of maybe humans, is to spread their genetics. And so, natural selection, what that does is the rules of natural selection is whoever is best set up to survive in their environment will typically get to pass on their genetics, which means you get to have more babies. Because the longer you live in the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom, the more babies you get to have. And the end goal is, again, to spread your genetics. Okay. When humans take over or they select for traits, it's called evolution by artificial selection. So, artificial selection is when we are choosing the traits that we want. So it gives the examples of dogs, but ones I like is ones that kind of make sense a little bit more to me. Is if I am a cattle farmer, I am going to want to get the two fattest cows and breed them together to get hopefully an even bigger cow. Okay. Or if I have good crop yield from this corn that I've been growing in this field, I'm going to try to make sure it only breeds with other crop in that field and not a smaller, dinkier crop. Because I want the most money for my, uh, our crops. I want to make the most money, right? Um, so if you didn't know, the wild mustard is actually the ancestor of Brussels sprouts, which are these right here. They're the little green vegetables that are round and taste disgusting. Cauliflower, it's the white broccoli looking thing. Broccoli, cabbage, kale, and wasabi. Never heard of that. But all of these come from the mustard, the wild mustard plant, and they have been bred over time um, the way we wanted them. So for some reason, we decided we liked the taste of Brussels sprouts, maybe, or they keep well, or something like that. I'm not sure why you'd want Brussels sprouts; they're disgusting. But we have bred them to be selected for that. Okay, and then we liked cauliflower. Again, smells like old shoes. Not sure why you like it. Broccoli makes sense. Cabbage makes sense. So we were breeding things that looked like Brussels sprouts together, and that gave us more of a defined Brussels sprout over a long period of time. So natural selection again survive. Natural selection is evolution through natural mechanisms, often termed survival of the fittest. So it's not really survival of the fittest; it's survival of can do enough to pass, right? So you don't have to be the fastest gazelle to survive. You just can't be the slowest, right? A lion's going to go after the slowest gazelle, but you don't have to be the fastest. But the more fit you are, the more opportunities you're going to have children because you're going to be able to live longer, which means, again, you get more opportunity to reproduce. So, Darwin's theory of natural selection, Darwin was a scientist or a naturalist, and he went on a boat for, I think, 5 years and went all around the world and started taking observations and kind of came up with, or at least is accredited with most people, the theory of natural selection and evolution. Some key ideas that he had is individuals produce an excess of offspring, so more times than not, our organisms that we're talking about are going to produce a lot more than what they probably need to continue their genetics. Not all their offspring survive, so that would make sense. They produce a lot more than what they actually need. Different traits get passed on from parents to offspring. So the offspring are never going to look exactly like the parents, especially in sexual reproduction situations. They're going to be a combination of the two, and the better combination will usually survive. And which leads me to the last one: those that have the ability to survive and reproduce pass on their traits. So again, your goal as an organism, plant or animal, is going to be is to pass your genetics on, and the way that do that is to be best adapted for your environment. So looking at this picture right here, we can see an example of that. So there's a crustacean that its parents of the offspring vary in body size. So it looks like maybe mom was bigger and dad was maybe smaller, or at least they had the genetics in there. They had four little babies. Two of them got eaten, one survived, and another one survived. And here it says the larger offspring are easily seen by more fish. Thus, the more offspring that were small could survive and reproduce because the fish didn't eat them. Well, now these two offspring are going to mate, and we have one big gene and mostly small genes. And so all of our small genes are going to hopefully take over. And that leads to us being able to have more kids because this fish cannot see us to eat us, which means our genetics can keep spreading. So they were, in this case, a smaller bug was better adapted for its environment and surviving with the fish. So evolution can occur through random events, which is or random processes, changes that alter genetic composition over a population over time. Evolution occurs if the population's fitness, the ability to survive and reproduce is improved, leading to adaptation. So, evolution only occurs if that species is getting better at living life in their environment. So, if I was a monkey and I use my tail for hanging on branches and things like that, and I have a kid who, for some reason, doesn't have a tail, he can't swing on branches, that means he can't get as far away as fast from predators, or he can't hang on branches to get fruits and things like that. That would not be an example of evolution because that adaptation does not help them survive. So this process can occur through many different avenues. So mutations, the changes to genetic variation of a population; gene flow, individuals moving from one population to another; Genetic drift is a simple change in genes over time due to random mating. Bottleneck effects a reduction in the size of a population of genetic variation. And then finally, the founder's effect. A few individuals begin a new population with genotypes not represented by the entire group. This is an example of gene flow. So in Florida, there was a population of panthers that declined, and there were not that many of them. So what the U.S. Wildlife and Fisheries did was they brought some panthers from Texas. They let them go in Florida, and now we are introducing new genetics into the situation because what was happening was all of these panthers were the only ones left, so they were only breeding with each other, which, as you can assume, incest did not do well for their genetics. So the U.S. Wildlife and Fisheries needed to introduce these panthers from Texas. And after doing that, there was less inbred, and the percentage of the kink tails or the mutations decreased. This is an example of a genetic drift. So the majority of the population right here is white, and so for whatever reason, they decide not to mate with these guys, or these ones decide to mate. But mostly, we have white mice, and then eventually, we only have white mice because they are just not breeding with the black mouse. This tends to be more harmful in smaller populations because you're going to lose a lot of your genetics just based off random events. It obviously doesn't affect the bigger populations as much because we can see that our black mice and our white mice have the same percentages over here, even though the population did decrease. So it did get smaller compared to that one, but the ratios are still the same because they're still big enough that they can mate with multiple mice and keep those genes in the gene pool. Okay, this is an example of the bottleneck effect. So we'll say we are in the Serengeti, and this entire habitat had a wildfire. And what happened was it took out all of these, not this one, it took out all of the rest of those cheetahs. And so now you're left with, instead of we had 10% no spots, 50% small, and 40% big, we're left with 0 spots, 33, and 67. Well, these are the only three ones left, so they can only mate with each other. So it's going to just be a variation of these, and we lost the entirety of our no spots. And that's an example of the bottleneck effect. So something happens where it takes out a portion of our genetics just randomly, and we're left with whatever is left. This is an example of the founder's effect. So the founder's effect is exactly what it sounds like. There's a pioneer species that discovers some new area. They leave their current population, and they go to an island, and they create their own population, and they don't get disturbed. And so eventually, they just have their own population, which means they have their own genetic base, and so they kind of sort themselves out like that. So our second standard is explain how evolution can occur over time, over short and long timescales. So our second standard, explain how evolution can occur over short and long timescales. Through small changes such as microevolution, small changes can lead to larger changes in species, known as a macroevolution. So it might start as a microevolution because eventually they're going to get further and further away from the mean. And there are two common ways in which this happens. So the first one is called allopatric speciation, and that is a geographic separation in population leading to a new species. We'll look at that in just a second. And the other one is sympatric speciation, so genetic isolation without geographic separation in a population leading to a new species. So allopatric means that there was something separating them. Sympatric means that there was genetic isolation. So on this side of, or excuse me, this whole slide is talking about allopatric speciation. So originally there was a Field. If a river decides to split the field, thus splitting the population, and then we get into a little bit of genetic drift, and one side of the population becomes less diverse, and the other one becomes less diverse from that one, and then eventually we just have brown mice and white mice who at one point were related, and now if the river went away, these two populations would still be very different. They can no longer interbreed together just because they've bred so differently for so long, being separated by a geographic issue such as a river or a mountain or something like that. So this is sympatric speciation. So these are all wheat, but we have different types of wheat. I think a better example of that is the finches from Darwin's travels. So obviously, they started as one type of finch, and they grew to be species of other finches, and they were all on the same islands. They were not separated from each other, but one of them decided, not decided, one of them had a genetic mutation that made it easier for it to do this thing with its beak. And other birds saw that, and it became more of a adaptation. And so they breeded with that bird, and then their children had those beaks to be better at eating this particular food, for example, or digging in the holes or digging in the trees. And that just kept happening with all their genetic random mutations. And now we have all those different species of finch. Evolution can occur at different paces. Evolution typically occurs slowly depending on the pace of the external change. So if there is a slow change, such as global warming, which is getting faster every day, our evolution will typically happen a little bit slower than if we were um, being burned by lava. Then our evolution would change quickly, right? If a population has long generations, this can lead to slow evolution as well. If the evolution can be rapid, it changes. If the change is rapid as well. So the older an animal lives, the longer it takes for evolution to occur. So think about things that live long, like humans or dogs and things like that. Those take a long time because it takes forever to get to breeding age, and then your species are just not very rapidly producing. Whereas, like frog populations have a lot of babies at one time, or even bacteria, they have short lifespans, and so they're reproducing constantly, which means there's more probability that they will have a change in their genetics in that time being. Evolution can be rapid if the change is rapid. So speaking of um, bacteria or viruses, you could see the COVID-19 virus change very rapidly and became different forms based off of external environments, which made it easier for it to infect more people and spread more rapidly. We had our different variants, and it seemed like each variant decided that it was going to be able to spread a lot more quickly. Consequences of rapid change can be quick extinction. So if you change too quickly, you become a specialist instead of a generalist, and who knows how long that change will be good for you, and you might die. Rapid evolution can be seen in artificial selection. So artificial selection is the fastest form of evolution because humans are going to pick what they want based off of when they want it, and they want it now, right? So a dog breeder now, it might have a bunch of dogs over the course of its lifetime, but if the average person lives to about 90 years old, they could have already been breeding that dog to be more what they wanted just in that 90-year time span, which sounds like a lot of time, but when we talk about the time scale of the year, or excuse me, time scale of the world, it's not. So when we genetically modify organisms, or when we insert genes into organisms, these are called genetically modified organisms, or GMO. So artificial selection is technically a form of GMOs. And so even if your food says that it's GMO free, it's probably not, because again, as a farmer, I'm going to try to pick the two best of my crops that I'm making food with and breed them together instead of just letting them naturally breed with whatever they would come into contact with. One good example. So one of the things that your book mentions is BT cotton and BT corn, and so what we have done with that is we've actually inserted a bacteria into the genetics of the corn and the cotton, and that bacteria is naturally a pest resistant, and so now the corn and the cotton put those genes out, and it becomes like a natural pesticide, which is pretty interesting. We combined two different things and made them better. That is your module 13. Let me know if you have any questions.